right.
Anytime you can start.
We are all set. I'll start by introducing today's talk. So, welcome everyone. My name is Tomoe Fuji, and I am a master's student in global governance and diplomacy at the Oxford Department of International Development, ODID. On the screen, you can see my co-moderator, Maurice Kirschbaum, who is also a master's student in ODID, reading migration studies. And this is the second edition of the COVID Flash Talk titled Anthropological Solace, Social Analysis Between Understanding and Caring in the COVID-19 Crisis. COVID Flash Talks is a new initiative supported by ODID, which aims to create a space in which academic debate can be started around the current COVID-19 pandemic with reference to the issues dealt inside the department. The initial idea came to us when, at the early stages of the pandemic in the UK, students from our department came together longing for meaningful academic content about what this whole situation meant for our field of study. In today's talk, our two presenters will have at their disposal 25 minutes of time in total, and we aim to move to the Q&A session at 2:30. The whole event is expected to finish at 2:50 p.m. to allow the professor to join his own master students at 3. Please do not refrain from posting questions in the Q&A section that you all should see below, even during the presentation. But first, let me introduce to you to our guests. Joining us from Rome, we welcome Professor Piero Vereni. He has conducted fieldwork concerning identity in border regions in Macedonia and Northern Ireland, and now he teaches cultural anthropology at Roma Tor Vergata University. In normal times, you will see him with his gaudy hat, his colorful bow tie, wandering in informal settlements in the Roman suburbs. But now, at home amid the longest and most stringent lockdown in the West, he has been very active on his blog and in interviews where he has reflected a lot on what should social scientists do in these times of crisis. He will be sharing with us some of his thoughts today. Joining us from London is Kushal Sohal, Master Student of Modern South Asian Studies at St. Antony's College, Oxford. His research focuses on Indian educational philosophy, namely that of Rabindranath Tagore and Mahatma Gandhi. If it weren't for the pandemic, you would see him in front of the Radcam informing and campaigning against discrimination of Muslims in India. However, since the start of the crisis, he has been very active by co-founding the Facebook forum, What Does COVID-19 Say? And by sharing his reflections on the role of educators during and after COVID-19. We are looking forward to your presentation. But now, without further ado, Professor Vereni, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much. So I'll set my timer to 15 minutes. Is that correct? Tamoy, please can you confirm this? Because I don't want to go too further ahead with my presentation. And yes, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this brilliant, let's say, initiative that you have organized. I think it is really important the students are able to manage their own seminars. And this is really a brilliant opportunity for me also to try to say something that I have been thinking about since the crisis of coronavirus started in late February, early March, at least from the Italian perspective. So I would like to tell you basically one thing. And the thing is that social sciences can be really important in not only understanding but dealing with this crisis. I think that this is the strong point of my quick presentation. It is the fact that we can have a voice in supporting common people in dealing with the situation. Okay, this is really the bottom line of this presentation. I have to start a bit from afar, from the reasons of social sciences in general. There have been, let's say, two basic principles that moved the research in social science during the 19th and the vast part of the 20th century. One is the nomothetic or explanatory approaches, the attempt to find causes, to explain and discover the laws of human behavior. And we've had, the classic theories of the 19th and early 20th centuries, like evolutionism, functionalism, and even structuralism, even though it was very critical towards some aspect of evolutionism and functionalism. Even French structuralism was still trying to discover some laws. Maybe Claude Lévi-Strauss would talk about l'esprit humain, the human spirit, not human behavior, but the reason was still this nomothetic approach to reality. Then a parallel movement of epistemological approach to social sciences tries to develop a more ideographic or interpretive approach to social reality. It is not really important to explain the causes, but we, as Goethe summed it up, we must learn to grasp what we cannot embrace. So he was referring to cannibalism, for instance, or other unacceptable from our perspective behaviors that nonetheless need to be understood. Of course, there is a non-causative notion of explanation in this case. Explanation is not anymore to identify the relationship between the cause and its effects, but it is more a semiotic notion of explanation as indeed interpretation. Okay. But these two main strands of epistemology of social sciences have been soon flanked since, let's say, the end of the Second World War by this critical theory approach, where I lump together the Frankfurt School, let's say, or Adorno most of all, and also the new arrived Michel Foucault and his genealogical approach. According to this notion of social sciences, culture and in general the whole symbolic field are seen as something that covers, that hides from our gaze the gaming, the plays of economics and politics. So the relation between some economic dimension and some political dimension of one basic force, which is power. Okay, so in that view, the aim of social analysis becomes something different. It is not anymore the discovery of laws or the right interpretation. It is the unveiling of that has remained hidden from our gaze for too long. Of course, the reference is to three main names, Nietzsche, Marx, and Freud, that in different ways highlighted this hermeneutics of suspicion. So the fact that you must be aware that there are some power or economic or unconscious gains going on another level from what is the conscious level of reality. The consequence is exactly this hermeneutic of suspicion. Okay? The fact that you always try to discover, to bring to consciousness what has been hidden. There are some implications of this hermeneutic of suspicion. The first is that the native voice becomes part of the game. You're not interested anymore in trying to understand what the native says at the surface level, because that voice, that superficial voice, is part of the game. And the native himself or herself is spoken by the same hidden rules that play elsewhere. So there's no real need anymore to confront, to compare your interpretation as a social analyst with the view of the native, because you may always say that the native is deceiving themselves. Okay, they are deceiving themselves. So whatever they say, you can say that this is not true because the true reality lies behind that superficial level. And then, but there is another implication that somehow contradicts this one. It is the fact that the native is the only one who can really talk for themselves. Why is it so? Because an hermeneutic of suspicion entails the fact that you cannot really trust anybody outside a very narrow circle of, let's say, of people you can trust. And who are those whom you can really trust? Are those who belong to your basic unit of social life. So the point, the paradox is that the native is the only one who's allowed to talk for themselves, but at the same time, it is denied the let's say the value, the truth value of what they are stating. So the consequence is a strange, and even stranger paradox, or a conundrum, or a deadlock, where some relevant part of social theory ended up in these last, I would say, 15 or 20 years. It is the fact that you must rely on a native critical voice in order to understand what goes on, which is, of course, a paradox, because if it is critical, it can hardly be native, and if it is native, it can hardly be critical according to the principle of the hermeneutics of suspicion. So you end up by having this endless game of political correctness where everybody denies the other the right to talk in the name of someone else, and to some complexities of the current theoretical situation of social sciences that, I mean, I think it is really, really poor in terms of capability of explaining, of dealing with some social issues, and it focuses mostly on, let's say, the brightness of the author, the obscure nature of some points of the analysis, the difficulties that the hermeneut, someone who's trying to understand it, has to make. You have to make a lot of effort to understand those complex theories, and it is not anymore relevant to what extent those theories are related to what people, let's say, the object of that theorizing process is involved in. Okay, I would say that the COVID-19 crisis is really disclosing the paradox of this approach, because the crisis doesn't fit the hermeneutics of suspicion. Suspicion is related to unraveling the illusions of consciousness. But when you have to deal with natural disasters like a pandemic there's no space anymore for consciousness. Consciousness is not a relevant variable. And so you don't know anymore where to locate suspicion. The COVID-19 crisis tells us about the control of our awareness, not by power, but by something else. Power is always intended as human power, but by something which is not in human hands, which is nature. So in order to explain what I mean by this, why COVID-19 crisis can really show us the limits of a certain suspicious approach to social sciences, I would like to briefly describe a model of space where that has been involved in the coping with COVID-19. So according to the classic the Weberian model, we can try to describe some ideal types of the notion of space. On one edge, we have a reified, quasi-thing, and almost privatizable notion of space. On the other side, we have a relational, similar to action and sociably shareable notion of space. What do I mean? I mean that, for instance, you can look at the way in the United States the space has been perceived as something that can be possessed, shared, divided, bought and sold, whilst on the other extreme, on the other edge, you have the way South Korea dealt with coronavirus. South Korea and other Asian countries, like Taiwan, for instance, they dealt with coronavirus from the perspective that you have to be able to trace the social relations, not the spaces. Whilst in this reified notion, the first notion, the moral dimension of the space is already built in the space. In the social, in the relational notion of space, that moral dimension, which is of course at the same time pathogenic, it is the dangerous form of space, is produced through socialization. In Italy, we have a perfect example of this opposition. We have somehow in a way, the coexistence of these two models. In the case of two regions, Lombardy and Veneto, they are two adjoining regions in northern Italy where the virus first spread. One in Lodi, a region in a part of a city in Lombardy, and one in Vo, a small town in the province of Padua in Veneto. Nonetheless, the two cases went entirely differently. You can see here the numbers of swabs, and here you have the consequences of that different approach to the epidemic. Infected people and death toll was totally different. Whilst in Lombardy, there were 14,000, now almost 15,000 people who died because of the coronavirus. In Veneto, even though the crisis started exactly the same days, they managed to control the situation and have less than 1,000 people dead. Why was it so? I think it is because of this man. Andrea Crisanti was a professor at Imperial College and who moved to Padua, and he imported a socialized notion of space. Space is not by definition safe or unsafe, as they did mostly in Italy, let's say opposing the house as the safe area to the street as the unsafe area. The space was divided according to the movement of individuals and tracing their movements across the space. It is the movement of people, the movement of single individuals that creates a pathogenic or a safe space. I see from the time that I don't have time to, but maybe there will be time during the discussion to present a couple of examples about the way Italian politicians discussed if to wear or not to wear a mask, and the way Italian schools were shut down early at the beginning of the pandemics. But I will just refer to an article written by Per Bloch, who is a professor in Oxford University, where he tries to present exactly a positive notion of the space that can be controlled, through which the diffusion of the pandemic can be controlled by offering the possibility to individuals to create their own safe social environment. There are social bubbles according to which if you have been infected, the whole bubble is isolated, but you try to have relations only inside the social bubble. You see, it is a completely different notion from the reified notion of the space. The space is produced by humans. And I finish with this, let's say, I don't know how to call it, so this hope, let's say. Clifford Geertz told us that we must learn to grasp what we cannot embrace. And this, I think, is still useful as a motto for social sciences. Nonetheless, when the social scientists go into the life of everyday life, we have to learn how to teach to accept what we cannot fully understand. We have to teach people that they should accept different notion of space, even though they're not used to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your presentation and for sticking to the time. I hope there will be questions related to your examples later. And now the floor is yours, Kushal.
Thank you. Thank you to both Mo and to Tamoy for inviting me to speak on this, and to Professor Vereni for some really interesting insights, and to everyone joining in and hopefully having a good discussion after. I suppose my little presentation is going to be picking up on one or two of the themes that the professor mentioned, especially trust, consciousness, and hope, I think were the ones that I thought particularly relevant to what I'm going to talk about, and that is education in COVID-19, in the moment of COVID-19. And I want to just begin really briefly before going into the Indian example of just a few things that we know from the news and from the news, I suppose, and from having our discourses. We know obviously that this is a lived crisis by some and a very observant and privileged one on terms of others. We know that there are schools in rural and urban areas which are dealing with this very differently. We know that access to internet is not the same in one part of the country as opposed to another, and that is having an effect on things like homeschooling and examinations and testing. We know that there are different communities being mobilized, and the fact and whether the extent to which they're being mobilized is also dependent on geography as well. We know that there's a formal and informal educational questions to be answered here. But fundamentally, I think that this is posing real questions for what we think education is in the first place. What is its purpose? And that's kind of where I want to head. Like I just mentioned, this is there's no particular shared, this is in some ways a shared experience, but it's very different as well. People are having different socio-emotional experiences here. And if there was ever a time to think about an educational system that produced more empathetic conversational spaces, now I think would be that time. And that's kind of where I'm going to go and talk about the invisible side to this pandemic, and that might be the mental health side and what kind of educational things we can be thinking about in light of that. So moving over to the global south and to India, I want to talk briefly about Gandhi and Tagore's ideas of education and how they could be useful for us going forward. So there is broadly, I think, a spiritually humanist philosophy of education in India, which is not actually in reality in action, but it's there in thought nonetheless, and it's worth thinking about and perhaps in many ways realizing. Gandhi and Tagore, these are two thinkers of the early 20th century who very much debated the educational question, one championing more discipline, one championing more artistic spontaneity. But you have this shared desire for the educational space to be a liberating one, which is about pursuing truth. And alongside their interlocutors and their counterparts in other parts of the world, you get this kind of idea that you have to reject rote learning, you have to move away from a self-centeredness which gives rise to materialist and capitalist culture, and you should aim for an education that inculcates creative freedom and critical selfhood, and build totality and personality, Gandhi's famous idea of head, heart, hand. You need an education system that provides all three, and that enables the expression of all three of those. So where do I want to head now? I want to talk to you briefly about the idea of vulnerability in the educational space and why that's probably particularly interesting to think about in our given moment. Now, according to these thinkers, the educational movement is one which initiates vulnerability. The idea is that you produce emotional human experiences that will allow you to critique the closed-mindedness that your societies have built up. This idea, I suppose, if we think about it in colloquial speak or very, in a short little phrase, I suppose it would be something along the lines of feel the feelings. That's kind of where they're heading here. There is this idea that the current society has built up walls based on your self-centered behavior and based also mostly on a kind of apathy and paranoia that comes from not reckoning with what Professor was saying earlier, with the things that you don't know, not reckoning with them in a peaceful way. And you kind of, by not reckoning with them in a peaceful way, you build up this cold and fragile ground from which you create which is liable to destruction and kind of moves humans away from their natural position. So that's essentially what the educational space should be creating. It should be creating emotional moments for discourse to emerge. And ideally that discourse will take in a peaceful direction. So for Gandhi, there's one idea I want to quickly pick up on, and there for Tagore one, and then I'll give you a couple of examples of real live action today to think about. I want to briefly mention Gandhi's idea of history, because I think that's quite relevant to COVID-19. Gandhi is known for rejecting history because history is often the narrative of violence. It's the narrative of wars. It's the narrative of things like pandemics. And he rejects that narrative because history is not violence. History is non-violence. Because how else do you explain your presence today? How else do you explain the fact that you are alive right now if it weren't for non-violence being the norm? So the idea here then is that these moments of violence are destructing something which is your norm. And in those moments, the shared kind of empathetic humanity, the kind of shared human consciousness that is brought to life in these moments, it's made that much more stark. And then you're encouraged by virtue of the kind of educational thought that he goes into along the lines of service, and it's very much community based, to actively do something about this. It really brings things out in the open when you have violent moments. It reminds you of your non-violence in a way. This idea is actually underpinned by hope, which was one of the ideas the professor mentioned earlier. It's underpinned by the idea that you need only remind people of their non-violent nature, and they will, as a consequence, quit the sphere of paranoia on their own. So that's one idea to think about with relation to COVID-19. And with Tagore, for me, his idea of disinterest is quite interesting. Now, obviously in our discourse today, we think about disinterest as people of just being uninterested in something, of rejecting something, that you find it boring. But for him, it means something quite different. He says, humanity is a divine harp of many strings waiting for its one grand music. And he goes on in this quote to say that you only are able to create harmony in diverse places through a disinterested spirit of cooperation. And this implies that you have no agenda when you go into dialogue with what's unknown or what's different. You suspend your judgment in those moments. And so rather than having a destructive idea of ignorance that drives you, you instead have a kind of serene embrace of that ignorance, and this kind of leads to a disinterested moment of cooperation. So ultimately, for the pair of them, you are seeking some kind of freedom in the educational space. And these are things I think we could really be thinking about now, because are our educational spaces really producing that kind of mental freedom and that kind of, that emergence of critical selfhood? Is there an insistence on being productive as opposed to being constructive? Is there an insistence on, working to earn as opposed to being natural and experimental with your ways? I want to conclude very briefly with a mention of a couple of people who I've been grateful to be in dialogue with, who I think are doing really good work in this space, and in particular with relation to COVID-19 as well, just to give you some ideas of action as opposed to mere philosophy. One is Gwen Yi. She has this. She is the founder of Tribeless. They run this thing called Empathy Box, and the aim of it is to get people to share their stories in an empathetic way. And I spoke to her the other day about this moment and what it could mean for that kind of a socio-emotional learning environment. And they've taken this online. They've taken this formula online and they're experimenting with it online, and it's working in many ways. Another example is Leslie Udwin. She is the film director of the documentary India's Daughter, and she now has a charity called Think Equal, which promotes empathetic education for children aged 3 to 7. And there are loads of other examples of people doing this kind of work. And I think now in this COVID-19 moment, when a lot of things in your society are being exposed that bit more, these are things that we should probably be thinking about a little bit. And they're the kinds of things that in the little spaces that Tamoy mentioned earlier that I've been working in and trying to create, that I've tried to think about in my own small way as well. But I'm keen to hear your questions and have a good chat. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kushal. And thank you as well to you, Professor Vereni.